Alright everyone, it's time for another little bit of a philosophical video here about two extreme groups of people that I think primarily drive all culture forward, and sort of my own thoughts on it. My own thought is that like 99% of people, they don't really strive towards and aren't even necessarily capable of greatness, and largely it doesn't bother them because they just want to live their lives, be left alone. I think that there are two extreme groups of people. It's really what they are. It's not necessarily a problematic statement like, oh, you're extreme, it's bad. No, I just mean like they're at extreme ends of a sort of bipolar situation. Interesting juxtaposition between these two groups, by the way, and how they cross over, that really drive society. Because remember, culture evolves the same way biology does. It just does it faster. Linguistics and technology do the same. We need to start applying evolutionary theory to everything, and you can understand things more. Propaganda evolves. How do you think memes operate? At the lowest common denominator, it's almost like DNA. These two groups of people are as follows. First, you have extreme libertarians, and then you have extreme authoritarians. Now, the extreme libertarian, oddly enough, often becomes very authoritarian. Here's how. The extreme libertarian, in order to prevent others from abusing them, I think that a lot of dictators fundamentally, like, even people like Mao and Stalin, they feel abused by the current order of power. That is, they're actually power averse. They're disgusted by power situationally. In order to try to destroy that or prevent abuse of themselves or those around them, they become like a revolutionary or something, and they're actually originally motivated by a very libertarian mindset. This power is abusive, it needs to go. The problem is that they end up creating another similar power structure in trying to remove it. Very, very rarely do revolutionaries fight for what we would consider enlightened ideals. Like if you look at the French or American revolutions, you're looking at that sweet spot in history where it was possible for a few enlightened people to take advantage of the abuse of the masses in order to overthrow governments and implement things that were more enlightened, more libertarian in their structure. But that's an aberrance. Most of the time what happens is that some dictator comes along, they're abusive, military overthrows them, they abuse people, mobs come, military faction rises up, they get displaced, you get another dictator, you get an oligarchy or something, the church takes over. And so you have continuous revolution and counter-revolution. Some of those people that drive history, and these are strong people, these are the people that are centralized enough to create the skyscraper, to create the Colosseum or a Great Wall or something. The big things throughout history. One group, therefore, is very libertarian. They're motivated by a desire to prevent abuse of themselves or those things that they care about. They become the most brutal of dictators in so doing. The other group of people is strictly authoritarian even in and of themselves. They actually are drawn to power like a moth to a flame. And these are people that this is like an Alexander the Great, grows up reading the classics, geared towards power, warrior mentality, raised that way, doesn't have any problem, wants conquest, wants to go off and kill people, wants to create great things in a primordial fashion just to create them, just to leave behind a legacy. And so these two groups of people are the ones generally throughout history that are remembered. These are your great villains and they're your great heroes, depending on their actions, depending on whether they're victorious or not. Ultimately, history is written by the victors as well. So you can have somebody like, imagine, we remember, again, like Alexander the Great. We remember him as this great dude. But if he had been defeated at Guatemala or something, and the Persians had overrun his forces and captured him, he'd be remembered as a villain. They instead would have informed European civilization under Persian auspices, at least in part. There would have been some fusion, just like there was when he moved east. And there was, he didn't abuse the Persian people when he went through. Got great accolades for this. Went to Egypt instead of being like, Darius or something. He said, okay, you're free now. By the way, I'm going to worship your gods. And then they declare him pharaoh, which it must have pleased him because he definitely was into that sort of thing. By the way, history would have been vastly different if he hadn't probably drank himself to death. I'm not convinced that he was poisoned. I think he might have died of some septic ulcer or something from his apparent drunkenness. Didn't they accidentally burn, like, the temple complex? Like, when they took over Persia, didn't they accidentally fire the temple or something? Because they got too drunk. I think some of his soldiers, like, spilled the oil lamp or something and accidentally burned it to the ground. Or was it a library? I can't remember. A little bit dusty on my world history. I'm very, very sorry, my teachers. No. So these two groups of people are the ones that drive history. Everyone in between is sort of along for the ride. You have that 1% that is on the pole, on one end or the other, and then the 1% of the 1% are people that not only they have the drive, the motivation, the mindset, but I think they have the skill. And it's not just, well, you're a skilled individual. There's a little bit more than that. There's a certain something to certain people that draws others in. It's not just charisma. It's almost impossible to actually talk about what it is. And these are people that become, famous in some sense, great leaders or villains again. And again, really, they're the same thing. That's the other thing. People need to get out of the mentality of absolute objective good and evil and realize that that is informed by their upbringing, and that has to do with whichever culture is dominant at the time. The understanding of right and wrong that's held by maybe the average American is going to be different than someone who lives in a rural village where there's sectarian strife going on constantly and wild animals and disease and weird shit like that. It's going to be totally different. For them, kill your enemy, that's probably a good thing. I'm a warrior, fuck you, I killed the lion, I killed 3 dudes the other day, it was great, we, raided their village and stole their women. Well, if you're in that survival mode and there's really no civilization around you, that's a subjective good. What are you supposed to do? Let the lion kill you? Let the enemy raid your village? It's the same mentality. Western power structure is a little bit different. So philosophically, yes, I would say that there are 2 groups of people that primarily lead. Those that are kind of reluctant leaders, they're just being abused, they're created situationally. An abusive power structure exists and it turns the more extreme libertarian into a dictator. Sort of like that snake meme there. I'll post that on Twitter maybe later. Now, and then on the other end, there are people who they grow up reading Conan the Barbarian or something like, wow, this is great, and they want to go out and make their fortune. They want the sword and sorcery sort of life. They want to build great things. These are your great architects and dictators and stuff on the other end. And so I think those are the 2 groups of people. Ultimately, ironically, the worst dictators are probably basically anarchists at heart, because they create that power structure and they're motivated by self-righteousness even more than people who have an appreciation for authority. And so they can become the worst dictators. Like communists don't quite get it. Here's why communism can never win. It'll inevitably be internally displaced. It creates the abusive power structure that leads to more dictators and would-be dictators rising up to try to subvert the system, number 1, because it's not an enlightened system. Number 2, it's actually going to be led, more often than not, it's going to be led by someone who in their own life is a total libertine. They're going to say, do as I say, not as I do. By the way, I put you in gulag if you don't. Ultimately, that's what happens. That's why communism can never work. And that's why classical liberalism should be adopted as widely as possible. Constitutionalism. If you remove the abusive power structure, keep it at a minimum. Keep the state as blameless, propaganda-wise also as possible to its external foes. We see right now, one of the biggest stressors in U.S. culture is the fact that the U.S. government has been too opaque, has been not transparent enough, is too abusive, and so it gives fodder to all of our ideological enemies and diplomatic enemies around the world. It's easy for the Russians to make propaganda against the U.S. government. They left themselves open and vulnerable through their own actions, and they're not willing to take responsibility for those actions. Abusive power structure, and then they wonder why there are more extreme individuals rising up with extreme ideologies. Hell, most of them are, and when you try to suppress them, you're going to create the next wave of leaders. Ironically enough, you're basically hand-choosing who's going to lead the next generation. It's not going to be pretty for those that believe in, authoritarian leftist ideologies. And then that'll become abusive, and it'll do the same thing, and you'll get, anarcho-syndicalists who will rise up or something, or primitivists or something. That's about all. Peace out.